Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm not sure if everyone has joined yet, so I'm just going to give a sort of gentle introduction. Today we are talking about representing women. What can we learn from Latin America? And my name is Mina Cooper-Coles. I'm a research fellow at the King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And we are delighted to be hosting this event. We're particularly excited because we are bringing together work from all the people working at different levels at the King's, from PhD candidates through to our advisory board, with Johnny Lewandowski launching this report that we've written. This report is our first standalone report on Latin America, and it's also another first. It's the first in a series which we want to be diving into the literature on in different regions to understand how well women are represented around the world. We are thrilled to have a brilliant panel here to discuss this report and to contribute their own incredible expertise. Anna Gwiazda, apologies Anna if I pronounced your name right, is a reader in comparative politics at King's College London and an expert on women's political representation. Cecilia Makonyola is the head of practice and inclusion at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. And so she has on-the-ground experience of looking at how to improve the representation of women. Jennifer Piscopo is Professor of Gender and Politics at Royal Holloway and the author of dozens of academic publications on women in politics in Latin America. And last but definitely not least, Vanilda Souza Chavez is a visiting researcher at King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership. She is a co-author and has been the kind of coordinator of this final section of bringing it all together for this report representing women in Latin America. And she's also a PhD candidate at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. So she's also got this in-depth experience of looking at this subject matter. And without further ado, I will pass over to Vanilda, who will be giving us a short representation. Oh, actually, sorry, I'll just give a little overview of what we're going to be doing today. Vanilda will start off by doing a presentation, giving an overview of our report, and then we will turn to each of the different panelists for their discussions and comments before looking at some of the questions that have been previously submitted and that come from the audience about this fascinating subject. So thank you very much. And now, really without further ado, over to you, Vanilda, and thank you.
Thank you, Mina, for this introduction. I'll be sharing my screen with you. So you can see it, my screen, right? Yes. So I'll be presenting briefly the report. This report provides a global overview of the literature on women's political representation. And we did a comprehensive literature review in research that was written in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. The report is also based on evidence from international organizations, such as the Interparliamentary Union and the United Nations and Ipsos. It is structured in 4 sections to answer these questions. Where are the women in Latin America politics? Who are the women that are getting to office? What difference women make in politics? And what are the opportunities and obstacles for women's political representation? So going to the report, it's not common knowledge that Latin America is the leading region in terms of political representation. Here we can see a chart comparing the representation that women have in the lower houses of parliament or single houses in Latin America compared to other regions. So we can see that Latin America stands out. And this progress is not new. Latin America has been in the vanguard of women's political representation for about 30 years now. And here's a comparison with the global average of women in the lower houses of parliament around the world. So, and it's interesting to notice that there has been a steady increase in the percentage of women in parliament since the 90s, when the first gender quota was adopted in the region. it started with Argentina and then was followed by other countries. And moving on to where are the women in politics, women's political representation varies across the region and also across levels of government. So here we can see that some countries are more successful than others in representing women in politics in the region. Some countries like Nicaragua, Mexico, and Cuba have already achieved gender parity in parliament, while others have less than 20% of women in office, like Venezuela, Brazil, and Guatemala. And research always shows that it is as much due to the adoption of gender quotas that I mentioned before, and also the implementation of parity in countries like Argentina, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, and Nicaragua, for example. Parity is already adopted in 10 countries in Latin America. So the quotas legislation play an important role in getting more women into politics. And here is interesting, it's also interesting to notice that even in countries that are no longer democratic, as the case of Nicaragua, Mexico, and Bolivia, that are considered to be partially free by the Freedom House ranking, they have a significant number of women in parliament. But at the same time, I think it's important to point out that more research should be done to understand the spaces that women have within these governments. And also, I mentioned that representation, one of the research findings is that representation varies across levels of governments in Latin America. So there are more women elected to legislative roles than executive. So around 1/3 of women are council members and members of parliament, both in upper and lower houses. But when it comes to executive roles, the presence of women is lower. They represent around 15% of mayors. And then here we have a photo of Claudia Lopez, the former mayor of Bogota. She was the first woman to be mayor of Bogota and the first openly LGBTQ person. So it's an interesting fact. And moving on to our next section, who are the women? Women elected to office in Latin America are now representative of the whole society, as they are majoritarily white and high educated. So even though indigenous populations represent around 10% of the population of the region, the presence of indigenous people in politics is low. And it's similar to the situation to Afro-descendant people. The percentage varies across the region from 10% in Central America to 50% in Brazil and in countries in the Caribbean, but only 0.1% of women elected to parliament are from Afro-descendant. And this can be seen specifically in the case of Brazil. Women make up only 70% of Congress. So here a comparison between men and women elected in the last elections in Brazil. And out of the 91 women elected, only 29 are Afro-descendant and 4 are indigenous, and more than half are white. So women, with this data, we can see that women are being elected. This is the biggest number of women in parliament in Brazil, 91. But at the same time, they are being elected, but there are still some groups that are being left out here, Afro-descendant women and indigenous. So when it comes to the impact that women make in politics, we found out that they are responsible for supporting relevant issues and for putting them on the political spotlight, such as in issues such as the enactment of legislation on gender quotas and parity laws, the legalization of abortion in Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, and also for changing views around women as political leaders, as well as combating violence against women and girls. And as for the obstacles for women's political representation, there are ongoing problems that are related to culture and social norms that don't change at the same speed as legislation, for example. Also socioeconomic inequalities, care responsibilities that are mainly done by women, difficulties in assessing leadership positions within political parties and in parliament, and also political violence. They are targeted as candidates and also when they get into office. And as for the opportunities, the research shows that gender quotas are an effective tool for the representation of women in the region. The region is in the vanguard of the adoption of gender quotas, as I mentioned before, and also the adoption of gender parity by 10 countries, as well as the adoption of parity beyond the legislative branches. So parity is also being adopted in a significant number of countries for the executive and judicial branches, and also to institutions at the local level, which is really important to get more women in politics. And we also find out the importance of formal and informal women's organizations and grassroots movements to promote the access for women and promote the access and that they remain in politics. So overall, to sum up all the findings of this report, Latin America is a region that is sometimes overlooked, but this report shows that a lot of progress has been made in the region, and it is important to pay attention to Latin America because it is in the vanguard of increasing women's representation with the use of gender quotas since the 90s. And so it's not perfect. There are still a lot of barriers to women in politics, as I briefly mentioned here. And there are a lot of work still to be done, but these achievements can offer an important lesson for the rest of the world. So thank you. Here is the link to the report.
Thank you so much for that, Vanilda. That was a brilliant and very interesting summary of the report. So thank you. Now I think we're first going to go to Cecilia for if you have any. Is that all right, Cecilia? For some comments or discussions or responses. Right. I think you're still on mute. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Good, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I would just first really like to say how much I enjoyed reading the report. So thank you for having me here and inviting me to share my reflections on it. I found it to be such a rich and illuminating study, and I really believe it comes at a critical time. So thank you to the authors. There are a few things that I'd like to reflect on having read the report, and thank you for that kind of introduction to that as well, Vanilda. I really appreciated the detailed analysis and around which women are represented. It's clear that despite remarkable progress over the last 20 years in particular, in Latin America, similar to elsewhere, we're not seeing enough diversity in women's political leadership, reflecting existing and entrenched inequities between women. Given this reality, the extent to which we can expect substantive representation alongside this particularly quota-driven increase in descriptive representation, I think still feels limited. And I'd really like to reflect on a couple of areas surrounding this. In our work at WFD, I find the analogy of a single story really helpful when considering what kind of interventions we can build around women's political leadership, because we do have a kind of single story of political leadership that is highly contextualized but globally relevant. And it is one that is wrapped up in masculinity. And as such, the system that this single story underpins produces enormous barriers for women and non-binary people, particularly those who are othered and underrepresented due to racism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, and religious intolerance. And yet, when women enter formal politics, we often expect them to rewrite this ancient and deeply embedded text of this single story when they're not really even allowed to hold the pen yet. And I think this presents real kind of programmatic challenges and requires a kind of deeper thinking that I think this report really supports. One of the areas that I particularly liked to see this reflected in was the obstacle around marginalization that women face once within office. And this really mirrors the experience of WFD's programming as well. We work closely with women leaders, and one of the most commonly articulated challenges they face is their isolation, with both politically, but also at the interpersonal level within those institutions, which on the whole are designed more to facilitate competition politically than the type of collaboration that we see women leaders really excel at in shaping and driving political agendas. And we find that this is particularly challenging for those women who have come from a civil society background. And often that comes with sky-high expectations placed upon them from the people that have supported them, particularly the women's rights space. And they may have championed and advocated for that political leader. And once they're there, these women often find they don't have the political capital, space, or support to pursue the feminist agendas that they really believe in quite passionately. And I think one of the points that the report highlights really well is that until those institutions are fostering more inclusive, collaborative, and safer spaces for women, we're still going to have this challenge around substantive representation. Relating to this, I also found the distinctions that the report makes around which kind of women are actually leading, particularly between women political elites and everybody else. And I'd love to hear more about the Latin America experience of how these elites have used their power to lower the ladder to other women, which was alluded to in the report. This is a programming area that has proved challenging for us, and I think across the sector. We did a study a couple of years ago in the ASEAN region where we found that women leaders primarily came from the wealthiest and most politically connected families. And these privileged identities meant that they could navigate, negotiate, or completely circumvent some of the gender barriers that other women were really struggling with. And several of the women respondents in this report said that their gender really wasn't an issue on their relatively short path to leadership. And once there, they even reported that they had little to no incentive to kind of change the system around them because it hadn't presented them with that many challenges. And I think this is a key thing to consider when we're talking about these women political elites and essentially all the other women that the report rightly gives attention to throughout. What is the incentive for women political elites to really mobilize and support women that don't have those same privileges? And how do we support that to happen? Because we know that they will have access that other women might not have. And then kind of a third point that's sort of related to this earlier one is I'd like to reflect on this kind of representation of women and the kind of political choices that they make once in power in the context of the rise of autocracies. Which I think is a really critical point that comes out well in the report. And as it states, we don't really have much access to evidence about what happens behind the scenes with women that are often high-ranking in autocracies or more authoritarian states. Now, typically we think about democracy and gender equality as a kind of bundle of mutually reinforcing public goods. But we're seeing in real time how the kind of inclusive attributes that gender equality initiatives imbue democracies with have gradually been co-opted by non-democratic and authoritarian states in order to appear progressive, liberal, and democratic while diverting attention from persistent authoritarian practices. And what we're seeing practically from the programming side is that women with varying levels of political capital being instrumentalized by authoritarian regimes as the face of anti-gender initiatives. This is also the case with other minoritized groups, particularly racialized groups, which I think was important to note in this report as well, often sometimes used as the face of quite racist or xenophobic agendas. This allows these regimes to weaponize women's political participation within them to neutralize critique from the opposition, appease or attract support from the international community, and persuade voters of their democratic legitimacy. So what these 3 points really speak to me in particular that I think the report highlighted, and there's a lot to learn from in terms of the Latin America experience, is that there's a really clear need to make sure that our interventions in women's political leadership are not just diverse, but are truly intersectional. To challenge this kind of single story of leadership, we have to make sure that we don't expect a kind of single story of women's identities, because this really risks overlooking the challenges of how their gender interacts with political realities and power structures, how their political choices are mediated with other privileges and interests, and how gender can be weaponized to advance anti-gender and anti-democratic agendas. Intersectionality means allowing for that plurality of stories that exist at once. Now, the funding and political landscape don't always make this very easy, but if our efforts to widen access to power are not intersectional, as much as we're working with women in these positive ways and we're seeing real change in this descriptive way, the changes are not going to lead to that kind of substantive representation that we are all hoping for. We really need to match the kind of energy that these women that have overcome these huge barriers have, and redirect some of those energies into transforming institutions to be more intersectional in how they respond to kind of masculinized norms that shape political structures, cultures, and incentives. That means understanding the extent to which institutions, as well as individuals, can demonstrate that substantive representation of the diverse communities that constitute the public. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. That's, I mean, very interesting, and it's great hearing about how your programming at WFD kind of tries to contend with some of these incredibly difficult issues. And hopefully we can come back to some of the comments you raised in the discussion later, because I would love to engage with some of those a bit more. But for now, might we be able to turn to you, Anna, for your comments and reflections?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. I read the report with great interest, and I found it fascinating. And I would like to commend the authors for their wonderful work. Democracies are gendered, and we need to understand more about the reasons why, and we also need to understand what we can do about changes or introducing more gender equality. So in my reflections, I want to take a feminist perspective and comparative perspective, so feminist comparative perspective on the situation in Latin America, but I also want to compare Latin America with Eastern Europe. So the first point I want to make is that we shouldn't forget that women's descriptive representation is very important. So the very fact that Latin America is performing so well is fantastic news. There are many arguments in favor of women's descriptive representation. At some point, Anne Phillips said that it's a matter of equal citizenship. So we should strive and we should fight for higher women's representation in political institutions. It's also a matter of justice. We know that political institutions are given more legitimacy when minority groups are included. There's more trust, there are role models, and so on. So there are many advantages of having more women in politics. And the case of Latin America is fantastic because overall we can see very high levels of women's descriptive representation. But what Vanilda also pointed out, we can see that there's a significant variation. So there are countries like Guatemala and Brazil which are not performing very well. So I thought it would be also interesting to shed more light on Latin America by looking at another region, world region, and I focus specifically on Eastern Europe. And why? Because most countries in these two regions democratized at the end of the 80s. So they've had some 30 years, or more than 30 years of democratic experience. And it's really interesting to see how they've performed over this period of time. And the main finding is that Eastern Europe is lagging behind. Average women's descriptive representation is at 29%. However, if we only look at Central and Eastern European countries, it's only 25%, so it's quite low. And the question is why? So what is really the main reason which would explain the significant variation in terms of women's representation at this stage of democratizing, when countries started democratizing? And I think that the number one explanation is the role of formal institutions. So formal institutions defined as humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction. It's a definition presented by Douglas North, who talked extensively about formal institutions. And here we look at the role of laws and constitutions. And we can see that indeed, in the case of Latin America, most countries are using gender quotas or legislated gender quotas, which are considered to be formal institutions. And this is part of the success story. But I also like the emphasis which was placed in the report on the fact that it's not only about the presence of gender quotas, they should be well designed. And we know that quota size is very important. So of course, if there is parity, 50%, we would expect very good results. But also placement mandates and sanctions for non-compliance are additional tools which are very important. So the emphasis on formal institutions is very important. So again, looking back at Eastern Europe, we can see, especially in Central Eastern Europe, there are no gender quotas. So gender quotas haven't been used. There's only one country, which is Poland, which adopted gender quotas in 2011. Quotas are used in Southeastern European countries, and over there, women's representation is higher. But in countries which are not using quotas, one would say this is really the main problem. Looking at the case of Poland specifically, Poland is underperforming given the fact that the country is using quotas, because women's presence in parliament is 29%. And the main reason behind that is the fact that there are no placement mandates, and quota size is only 35%. So it's quite low. But the main lesson we are getting from Latin America is that well-designed gender quotas are very important. And by looking at Eastern Europe, I could really confirm that this is the case. But another point I'd like to make is about the fact that women's descriptive representation or high levels of descriptive representation cannot guarantee feminist or progressive change. It might happen, but it doesn't always happen. And we could also see it in the report that in several countries, so for example, there was an example of Mexico, a very high percentage of women in the legislature, yet significant problems with violence against women and cases of femicide. On the other hand, the case of Nicaragua, again, a very high percentage of women in parliament, yet very strict abortion laws. So in this context, when we talk about the link between descriptive and substantive representation, we can also consider other factors or obstacles in order to understand why high levels of descriptive representation do not translate into high levels of substantive representation, meaning the representation of women's interests, or more specifically, the representation of feminist interests. And here we can obviously point out the role of political parties or political ideology, how socially conservative parties might be less friendly towards feminist or progressive ideas. We can talk, the case of Brazil provides an example of how political parties used to block, or still in some cases they do block or withhold resources from female candidates. So the role of political parties should be discussed. We can also look at the role of grassroots feminist movements and how feminist activism is really important. It provides an important initial ground for women's activism, political activism, which then can translate into national level activism. And recently a report was published on feminist mobilization around the world, And it's a very interesting finding about Latin America. There are 3 countries with the highest level of feminist mobilization: Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. When it comes to Eastern Europe, only 1 country, it's Poland, with the highest level of modernization. When in other countries, it's much lower. So it would be interesting also to know how these high levels of mobilization can translate into more substantive outputs and outcomes. And the third point I want to make about obstacles is about the role of informal institutions. So the role of culture, traditions, norms, gendered norms, and how they provide in a number of environments significant obstacle for women to participate in politics. And the final point I really want to make is elaborate a little bit more on the point which was mentioned in the report with the reference to Argentina and most recent presidential elections, and the fact that President Mola eliminated or limited or basically got rid of the cabinet level ministry for women and gender equality, diversity. I think this was the name. And it again, thinking about Eastern Europe, we could see, by looking at the case of Poland and Hungary, we could see what happened in countries with populist right-wing governments. So in Hungary from 2010, in Poland from 2015 until 2023, both countries experienced gendered democratic backsliding, with a very detrimental consequence for the gender equality agenda, not only for women, but also LGBTQ plus people. So this it's important to look at the role of to what extent democratic backsliding has a gendered aspect, and by looking at these 2 countries, we could see that definitely there is this gendered aspect which might have very negative consequence for gender equality. So to sum up, while progress has been made in representing women, the process is ongoing and faces numerous obstacles, not limited to Latin America, but also present globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. That's a lot of food for thought, and it's really interesting seeing that comparison with another region which hasn't had the same level of quota implementation, and seeing what the differences are there. Thank you, and I'm sure we'll kind of come back to you again in the discussion later. Jennifer, can we ask you to be our final panelist on this and give your thoughts and reflections? I mean, considering we quoted most of you've written most of the works that we're quoting, it would be wonderful to have your expertise as a way of sort of summing up and answering perhaps some of the points Anna and Cecilia have raised a bit as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's fantastic to join and see so many people in the audience. Thank you all for sharing your lunch hour if you're in the UK, or another hour from another time zone with us this afternoon. So I was absolutely delighted when the team reached out and asked me to write the foreword to this report, but I also felt that it was a bit of a challenge, because the report, which I'm so excited for you all to read, is so incredibly comprehensive in reviewing the literature and the current trends in women's political representation, that I thought, I don't possibly know what I'm going to add in a foreword, because these amazing authors have said everything. And so I thought I then would use a bit of privilege to maybe make the foreword a bit more personal, and to reflect on what I've seen as some of the changes since I started working in the field. So looking at the report, which really puts together the numbers, I mean, we really do see that women's political representation in terms of numbers in Latin America, on average, we know there's variation by country, but on average has made remarkable gains in the past 20 years, and that women are generally well represented in national politics in most of the Latin American countries. And I wanted to reflect on this, and I thought back to the very first piece of writing that I did about women in politics in Latin America. And I went back to this working paper that I produced in 2006 while I was working on my PhD, when the scenario looked very different for women's numbers in politics at the national level. And I pulled out a statement from the report that then forms the basis of the forward. And so in 2006, I had written that tweaking one aspect of political institutions in order to resolve gender imbalances, so in this case, adding gender quotas in order to raise women's political descriptive representation. So making this tweak of introducing gender quotas merely causes the problems of women's exclusion to manifest in other parts of political life. So of course, I highlighted that even as women's descriptive representation did start to raise numbers, there were still challenges to women's political representation, as Vanilda and Anna have commented on. So I concluded in 2006 with this comment, quote, "The marginalization of women appears as an intractable problem when viewed across the political system as a whole." But when I looked at this 2020-24 report and I looked at the numbers, I thought, is it really the case? Do I agree with my past self that the marginalization of women appears as an intractable political problem when viewed across the political system as a whole? So like any good academic, I say no. Actually, I think women's political marginalization is no longer an intractable political problem, but also yes, because I'm going to reframe the question. So as we've seen, right, in terms of the numbers, if we have gender quotas and now gender parity laws, if we have a concerted political will to raising the number of women in political office, that itself is not an intractable political problem. We have 10 Latin American countries now that now have gender parity and elect legislatures that are comprised of substantial numbers of women and even a majority women legislature, as in the case of Bolivia. And responding to one of the questions in the chat, in fact, gender quota and gender parity laws also apply to the subnational level, and in many contexts, they also apply to unitary offices like mayors. And I can talk more in the Q&A about the mechanics of how that actually works relative to the design of quotas and parity laws. But we see that, in fact, they are quite comprehensive. Mexico has adopted a constitutional reform that mandates gender parity in everything, which is gender parity in the judicial, executive, and legislative branches at the federal, state, and municipal levels, and in the autonomous executive agencies. So really, this problem, when there is political will behind it, can be solved. But what I emphasize in the forward is this political will comes from the continuous sustained organizing by women in Latin America, by elite women, but also by feminist activists, also by women who are their allies, who are feminist lawyers, who are feminist judges, who are feminist journalists, to keep the pressure on political parties to implement the quota and parity laws as written, and also to go beyond them. And the rate of change has really been dramatic. I mean, as late as 2010, 2011, when I traveled throughout Latin America and spoke with women in politics, they would still talk to me about the dangers, right, of the challenges with ensuring that the then 30 and 40% quotas would be fulfilled. I think even 10 years ago, if somebody had thought, well, Mexico would adopt a constitutional reform mandating gender parity and everything, that would still have seemed like science fiction to many of the women I was talking to. And so there really has been a very impressive rate of change, and that has come from the pressure of women who are organized across and through political parties. And in the forward, I quote this really beautiful statement from a Mexican congresswoman whom I interviewed in 2015. And she speaks about the way that women across the generations have passed this baton to each other. And she says, when we are no longer in the right positions, we know that other women are, and that the women that come after us will look for ways to advance, right? So even as the earlier generation of political women has retired, the ones that fought for those first gender quota laws in the 1990s, the battle has continued by new generations of women. So not perhaps an intractable political problem in terms of the numbers, but if we look beyond the numbers, as my colleagues have said, there are some challenges that remain. The first very important caveat here is that the numbers are but one measure of gender equality. They are not the only measure of gender equality, and they tell part of the story. And so we know, right, that changing hearts and minds, eroding gender norms in the state and in the society is a much longer and more difficult process, right? And so this difference, right, between being able to alter the numbers of women in office, but also still strive for greater social change towards gender equality can explain some of the disparities that are highlighted here, such as ongoing rates of violence against women in Latin America, despite the high numbers of women in office. But I want to stress actually that if we think about violence against women, Latin America's laws to combat violence against women on paper are very feminist, very comprehensive, and very progressive. So if we think about substantive representation as women in political office achieving policy change, changing the laws and the policies, in fact, we do see quite a lot of substantive representation. Substantive representation is not the same as gaps in implementation. There are a lot of gaps in implementation. There are struggles in Latin America to effectively apply what on paper are very strong laws to combat and eliminate violence against women. So again, there's more progress to be done, but the progress isn't solely the responsibility of women in Congress, right? It's also the responsibility of all the other political actors in the state and in the society who need to work together, right, to realize the vision that's articulated in laws and constitutions. And so I conclude the report by highlighting 3 additional challenges to think about in terms of women's political representation, which is that first, as we know, despite the numbers, women in political elites still face an uneven playing field, whether it's access to campaign funds, media coverage, speaking opportunities, leadership roles, or even just respect. And we can talk more about those barriers. Second, as Cecilia spoke so eloquently, and as the report documents, the playing field is also uneven among women. We know that the gains in descriptive representation have accrued unevenly among women. But what I want to stress here is that at the same time, the minority men are as underrepresented in politics as minority women. And so elite dominance is a feature of politics. And so elite dominance is a challenge associated with women's political representation. And it's not just a challenge associated with, excuse me, did I say that? Elite dominance is a challenge associated with political representation. It is not just a challenge associated with women's political representation, right? Most women who access politics are elite, but most men who access politics are also elite. So as we work on broadening the pool of who our representatives are, of thinking about how do we recruit more outsiders, people from lower socioeconomic classes, Indigenous, Afro-descendants, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA+ individuals, and individuals from all underrepresented groups, we need to make sure that we are thinking about intersectionality in terms of both our women and our men representatives, right? That this is a problem that we all need to be solving irrespective of our gender. And third, as my colleagues have highlighted, we do see that democratic backsliding endangers the past decade's recent gains, especially in terms of the numbers in office, but also in terms of the substantive representation gains related to gender equality policy change. We know that women in office in semi-democratic regimes are not just or always tools of the autocrat, right? They continue to fight behind the scenes with the opportunities and resources they have to resist democratic backsliding where they can, but that's also not a fight that they can wage alone. And as Cecilia said so eloquently, women alone cannot save democracy or solve all of the problems associated with democracy. This is a cooperative exercise with which women's representation is just one part. So thank you so much for the opportunity to reflect on this report, both in words and in the presentation. It is a marvelous report, and I hope that you all will download and read it.
Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. That was, I mean, it's very exciting to have this kind of, to be able to be both optimistic but see the future challenge, which we don't often get in this sector. So that's wonderful. I was just to start with the Q&A, I thought I'd bring 3 questions together. If you don't mind me kind of summarising some from both from the previously submitted and which have just come through now. So bringing together the questions of Lizzie, Louisa from previously submitted, and Domenica. So this is kind of, I'm afraid it's going to be mostly back to you, Jennifer, because of your long period you've been studying Latin America. is about when you're implementing quotas. So they can be controversial, of course, men can feel discriminated against. So this is Louisa's aspect of it. So how can we bring men onto this journey? If we're also looking at the women who have been elected after quotas have been implemented, does it undermine their authority? How do they sort of prove their worth in office if they're seen as sort of the quota women? And also how were these quotas introduced in a region that is largely relatively conservative and where the Catholic Church plays a major role? Or is this thanks to the feminist mobilization that you spoke about as well? So that's sort of three questions of looking at some of the, I suppose we're looking at lessons we can learn from Latin America, how about the implementation of quotas. How did these often seen as the hurdles and the difficulties with implementing quotas, how are these overcome, or have they been overcome, and how are they introduced? Sorry, that's three things to throw back to you. So.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for the questions. There's been a lot written in answer to all three of these questions, and I'll try to give sort of a very stylized answer, which of course might erase some nuance, but sort of gives you a sense of the pattern as a whole. And so the context of re-democratization and democratic consolidation in Latin America is extremely important for understanding the history of gender quotas in the region. I know in 2024, we're all talking about democratic backsliding, but let's just go back in time for a moment to the late 1980s and the early 1990s, when the conversation was about the democratic transitions in the region and consolidating democracy. And so feminist advocates for gender quotas made very strong arguments about the importance of women's descriptive representation for deepening democracy and for realizing democracy, and for ensuring that during democratic transitions, what did not happen was that the political elites, who were then understood to be mostly men, just came in to occupy all of the electoral spaces, and that actually there was a genuine effort to democratize political power by opening up space for women. And many political parties, felt pressured to at least at the surface level, right, support gender quotas because of the way they became linked to arguments about democracy, right, and about including women in order to improve democracy. And so, as was mentioned, Argentina adopted the first gender quota in 1991, and many Latin American countries since followed. And so a lot of these conversations about quotas might allow women to come forward who don't have the experience or the preparation to be in politics, or quotas might undermine the way women are seen once they're elected. They were had in the 1990s, but what we've had since then is a process of political learning, and everyone has sort of gotten used to the fact that they are there. So it is true that in the early 2000s, when we spoke with women in Latin America, they felt that they might have to work a little harder to justify their political positions because they were perhaps diminished for having seen to come to office because of the quota. But as quotas stayed in place and eventually converted into gender parity, these concerns, we see them disappearing. I don't talk to any women in Latin America today who feel that their position on politics is devalued because there are gender quotas or gender parity in place. And I think this gives us heart for places where there are not yet gender quotas in place, that we see some of the initial resistance disappears over time. There is a process of learning, and people do get used to having these policies in place. And we never actually saw any empirical evidence that women who came to office because of quotas were less prepared or less skilled. In fact, they often had to be better prepared and more skilled in order to justify why they were, quote, taking the spot away from the men. So I think that is optimistic for gender quotas and gender parity, and optimistic for people's ability to get used to them, and that we see even in these conservative contexts that when, again, you have political will, you can change the numbers associated with the election of women. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and lovely to hear, again, another optimistic note that people just get used to it. Now, do Anna or Cecilia, do you have any comments on those questions about quotas, or shall I perhaps go on to another question? So there was one submitted before about cultural norms and stereotypes. and how these can influence public perceptions of women in politics, and have these been overcome. And perhaps Cecilia and Anna, you might be able to speak about your experiences dealing with cultural norms and stereotypes about women entering politics. I don't know if either of you want to. Cecilia, you look like you're about to press the button. Sorry.
I can go first. Sorry, I thought Anna had pressed it. Yeah. So yeah. Thank you for that question. It's really difficult to work on stereotypes and social norms, certainly from a kind of programming perspective. We do know that there are changes that, you know, have been looked at across time that kind of tracks countries that become more democratic, more affluent, having a change in terms of their stereotypes about women. And that's largely aligned to women's participation in the labour force and those kind of changes. But working on kind of actively changing the kind of stereotypes and ideas that people have around women as it connects to their leadership is much more difficult. And this is primarily because there's not enough work done on kind of the values, the norms, the narratives that are told around political leaders. And so, as I kind of mentioned in my earlier reflections, you know, community societies have quite a fixed idea in their head about what a political leader looks like. And the more you deviate as a woman, and then as a woman that might be othered by other parts of their identity, the more you deviate from that, the more you're seen as a kind of challenge to that status quo. But I have seen some interesting work done at kind of different levels in terms of ages, because so many of these stereotypes are developed, you know, in our first experiences and the way that we see leadership kind of presented to us at younger ages. There's some great work being done by organizations like Plan on kind of transforming ideas about gender with much, much younger generations. And while that can feel like a really distant approach, you know, we always want kind of long-term funding, long-term thinking for programming on these type of areas. I think it's a really critical one at this time where we are seeing not only this heightened level of violence, but this heightened level of radicalization. So younger women are facing extreme levels of violence, and young men are becoming more radicalized in many different regions of the world. And so with that in mind, starting to work on those ideas around norms and how people perceive leadership and who leads and how they lead, even the question of the specific ways that women lead and the way that they make those contributions, not just the contributions in themselves, are really critical at that age, at those younger ages. There are also good examples that we've seen in our programming of women political leaders themselves being able to kind of use the momentum of their campaigns and specific messaging within their campaigns to change narratives really powerfully. So an example that I like to draw on is from a Kenyan MP who was really associated with kind of being quite a homely candidate, and, you know, the press was using that against her. And when she returned to her community, she rallied the community of women that were supporting her and men that were supporting to come out in force with their kind of pots and pans. And she was able to leverage that kind of messaging of her campaign to kind of change the narrative of what leadership looks like, and that it still counts despite the kind of depiction that was being given to her in the press. So yeah, just to conclude that, you know, it's long-term work. The younger that we start working and thinking about these ideas, the better. But there is things that you can kind of capitalize on politically to kind of change specific narratives at a time around specific leaders as well.
Thank you, Cecilia. Anna, do you have anything you'd like to?
Yes, in fact, first I'd like to comment very briefly on gender quotas and whether they are accepted or not. And I remember in Poland, there was a very similar debate. So feminist activists would say, you know, we are living in half democracy. Women are excluded from politics. So they use the democratic argument in order to strengthen their argument. They should be part of the process, of the political process. And in the end, they put pressure on Prime Minister, and then gender quotas were passed. The question about cultural norms is very interesting, and it's really the question which can be asked in every single country, because the more I think we understand women's representation, the more we realize that there's so much about cultural norms and how in some circumstances they might be main obstacles to feminist change. And there's an argument in the literature that we need formal institutions first and foremost in order to change informal institutions. And we can find some support for this argument because, let's say, if we look at the case of Latin America, the fact, what just Jennifer mentioned, the formal gender quotas were introduced. And then over time, we could see that also attitudes have changed. It became a normal thing that women are part of politics. So there's an argument in favor of strong formal institutions, but there's also an argument about the role of education. And yeah, again, I will go back to the final point, is about difficult and challenging times we are facing right now, and how, despite feminist efforts, it might be still quite difficult to change norms because of the overrepresentation of socially conservative, anti-feminist interests in a number of parliaments around the world.
Thank you so much for that, Anna. And it's so useful having your comparison and seeing, you know, these different arguments for getting quotas put in place in different places. You know, it's seeing how the lessons have been adopted in different contexts. So just to bring to sorry, we've had so many brilliant questions. I'm trying to bring them, parcel them up into single questions for you. So someone previously submitted a question asking about the role of media and feminist journalists, asking, are feminist journalists an endangered species in Latin America? But if we kind of broaden that out to ask about the role of the media, and then to pair that up with another question which has just come through in the Q&A about the role of social media and particularly abuse against women in politics and perhaps feminist women and minority women in particular, and whether we see that as a threat to democracy more broadly. So that's sort of a broad question about the role of the media and social media to throw to our brilliant panel. Would anyone like to start? We've got a particular response they'd like to. And then I think this has to be our last question, unfortunately. So can anyone quickly give us a little thought on that, perhaps?
Sure.
Oh, Cecilia, please.
Okay, I'll be super quick. Yes, absolutely a threat to democracy. Just on a couple of really quick points. One, you know, we often think about violence against women in politics as being quite random or kind of one-off events or unfortunate or kind of the cost of politics, as it's sometimes called. But we do know that this is part of a coordinated response to the rise in women political leaders. These things are deeply interrelated. And so from that basis, it is a kind of a very clear threat to democracy that this is, you know, women are targeted the more powerful that they are. And that particularly affects racialized women. But also relating to that, one of my larger concerns around violence against women in politics is how it affects the political pipeline. You know, this particularly affects younger women who, you know, if you think about the generation coming up now, they're digital natives, you know, they're very at home on social media. It's where, for many of them, they'll have their first real political engagement that means anything to them. And so where that violence is experienced in this way that's kind of facilitated by technology, it really puts up a really strong deterrent when you see how technology is misused. And that really does worry me in terms of the women that are able to step forward who, having had that experience, will continue to want to engage in politics because the risk of that is so high. Sorry, Jennifer.
Jennifer, would you like to jump in for the, oh, I think we're over now. Sorry, I've just seen the thing and I'm worried that Zoom's now going to shut us all down. So sorry to cut you off before you can comment, Jennifer, but thank you all so much for your brilliant contributions. It's been a really exciting and interesting hour. We've been very privileged to have such a prestigious panel, and thank you, Nilda, for your brilliant presentation. I think we're about to be thrown out. So thank you all for attending so much. And I think that's it. Goodbye.